In the sprawling darkness of the rural Midwest, there lies a stretch of highway known only by its grim nickname, the Phantom Mile. Local legends whispered about it, cautioning all who dared traverse its cursed pavement after sundown. But these stories were no match for the curiosity and bravado of three college friends, James, Sarah, and Elliot, who found thrill in the unexplained and the chilling. One autumn evening, armed with a camera and a desire to debunk or capture ghostly phenomena, they set out in James's old Jeep, their spirits high with the anticipation of adventure. The plan was simple: drive down the Phantom Mile, film their experience, and hopefully snag something sensational for their YouTube channel, which flirted with the paranormal. As they approached the highway, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in ominous hues of orange and red. A chill ran down Sarah's spine, not from the cold, but from the eerie silence that enveloped them as they turned onto the highway. Elliot, always the skeptic, mocked the sudden change in atmosphere, attributing it to their overactive imaginations. The first few miles were uneventful, with only the occasional deer darting across the road breaking the monotony. They joked and laughed, the camera capturing their light-hearted banter. But as they ventured deeper into the secluded part of the highway, the mood shifted palpably. The trees seemed to close in, their gnarled branches casting grotesque shadows across the road, illuminated only by the Jeep's headlights. It was then that the radio, which had been playing softly in the background, began to crackle and hiss. James tried to tune it, but the static only grew louder until it was abruptly replaced by a clear, chilling voice that echoed through the speakers: "Turn back." The command was stern, devoid of any identifiable emotion. The trio laughed nervously, half expecting it to be a prank, but a look between them confirmed that none had orchestrated this. Deciding it was a bizarre coincidence, they pressed on, their laughter now tinged with unease. James focused on the road, his hands tightening on the wheel as a dense fog began to roll in, reducing their visibility to a mere few feet. Sarah, trying to lighten the mood, pointed the camera out the window, narrating their journey into the unknown. As she panned the camera back inside the vehicle, the screen flickered, and for a split second, it showed a fourth person sitting in the back seat. She gasped and spun around, but the back seat was empty. Shaken, she showed the footage to James and Elliot, who argued it was a trick of the light or a glitch. Their debate was cut short by a sudden, sharp decline in the temperature. Breath visible in the air, they watched in horror as frost formed on the inside of the car windows. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the cold vanished, replaced by an oppressive warmth. The fluctuations were inexplicable, defying all logic and reason. James, unnerved and determined to end their journey, attempted to turn the car around when the headlights flicked off, plunging them into darkness. The engine stuttered and died, leaving them stranded on the darkest part of the Phantom Mile. The only light came from the faint glow of the dashboard and the camera's night vision. As they tried to restart the car, a series of soft thuds came from the trunk, as if something, or someone, were trying to get out. Elliot, his fear overcoming his skepticism, insisted they check it. With trembling hands, James agreed, stepping out of the car with Elliot close behind. Sarah, left alone, turned the camera to herself, whispering a play-by-play into the microphone, her voice quivering. The camera's night vision painted everything in a ghostly green hue. As she spoke, a shadow passed behind the car, seen by the camera but unnoticed by Sarah. Outside, James and Elliot opened the trunk to find it disturbingly empty. Confused and terrified, they heard Sarah scream from inside the car. Rushing back, they saw the doors locked from the inside. Sarah was pressing herself against the driver's seat, the camera dropped on the floor, still recording as she stared at something off-screen. James and Elliot's shouts for her to open the door went unanswered as the windows began to fog up, obscuring their view. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the door locks clicked open. They tore the doors open to find the car empty. Sarah was gone. The camera, still recording, lay on the floor of the car. Elliot picked it up, panning around in a frantic search. There was no sign of Sarah, no trace of where she could have gone. The footage later showed nothing but their terrified faces and the fogged windows. Desperate, James and Elliot searched the surrounding area, calling out for Sarah. Their voices lost continued from part 1 among the dense trees. Their calls were met only with the eerie silence of the deserted highway. The fog seemed to thicken, swirling around them like a living entity, cold and unyielding. Every now and then, a sound would break through the silence, a crack of a twig, a rustle of leaves, as if something, or someone, was moving just beyond the reach of their flashlight beams. The search turned frantic as time passed. The night grew darker, the moon obscured by thick clouds, casting the world into an oppressive gloom. Elliot, his skepticism shattered, kept muttering to himself, repeating that it wasn't possible, that this had to be some nightmare they'd soon wake from. James, however, felt a deep, gnawing fear that what was happening was terrifyingly real. After what felt like hours, they stumbled upon a small, dilapidated cabin hidden deep within the woods. Its presence was so out of place that it chilled them to the bone. The wooden structure was old, the walls groaning with the weight of decay. The door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the wind with an ominous creak. James, with a mixture of dread and determination, pushed the door open. The interior was shrouded in darkness, the air thick with the smell of mold and something else, something metallic, a scent like blood. They entered cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the blackness, revealing a room frozen in time. Dust lay thick on furniture that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, and old newspapers were scattered on a faded rug. As they explored, Elliot's light fell on something horrifying, a series of photographs pinned to the wall, each depicting different groups of people on the Phantom Mile, their faces marked with fear. In the corner of each photo was a date, and the realization hit them hard: these were all people who had reportedly gone missing on this very stretch of road. The last photograph was the most recent, and to their horror, it showed them, their group, taken from a distance, on the highway just hours before. Below the photo, in jagged, chilling handwriting, was today's date. Elliot backed away, stumbling over a loose floorboard, his breaths coming in sharp gasps. James, although terrified, felt a surge of anger. Someone was playing a sick game with them, and he was determined to find Sarah and get out alive. He grabbed the photograph, tearing it down from the wall, when a soft, sinister laugh echoed through the cabin. They turned in unison toward the sound, their lights searching the shadows. That's when they saw her, Sarah, standing in the doorway to the back room, her eyes vacant, her expression one of utter despair. Relief flooded James at first, until he realized she was not alone. Behind her, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure, tall and thin, its features obscured by the darkness. "Sarah!" James called out, stepping toward her, but the figure moved swiftly, pulling her back into the shadows. Running after her, James and Elliot entered the back room, only to find it empty, no sign of Sarah or the figure. The only exit, a rusted door, was bolted from the inside, impossible to have been used. The room was a dead end, yet they had vanished. Desperate, they searched the room, finding an old, worn diary under a loose floorboard. The diary belonged to a truck driver who had once traveled the Phantom Mile regularly until he too had disappeared. The entries were increasingly paranoid, detailing sightings of a ghostly figure by the road, haunting whispers, and his growing obsession with protecting others from the highway's curse. The last entry was a chilling warning: "It's watching. It waits. Don't look back." The handwriting was shaky, frantic. James and Elliot, realizing the depth of the nightmare they were caught in, felt a profound dread settle over them. They were dealing with something beyond their understanding, something ancient and malevolent that had claimed the Phantom Mile as its own. The sound of a car engine broke through the night, startling them. They rushed outside, hoping against hope it was help. But the sight that greeted them was another layer of the nightmarish reality: their Jeep, idling in the clearing, empty, as if inviting them to escape. As they approached the vehicle, the radio crackled to life once more, the same chilling voice as before whispering, "Drive." Without hesitating, they jumped into the Jeep, the urgency to escape overtaking them. As they sped away from the cabin, the road seemed to stretch endlessly before them, the fog enveloping the Jeep as they plunged deeper into the darkness, their headlights barely piercing the oppressive black. Behind them, the cabin faded into the shadows, its secrets enveloped by the night, as the sounds of the unseen pursued them, a sinister reminder that some places continued from Part 2, are best left unexplored. The fog thickened, swirling around the Jeep like a living entity, seeming to pulsate with a malevolent life of its own. The road ahead was barely visible, each turn and dip a gamble against the unseen. James gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, as Elliot kept his eyes glued to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that chilling figure appear behind them. As they hurtled down the Phantom Mile, the echoes of the past mingled with the terror of the present. The radio sporadically crackled to life, disjointed phrases and eerie snippets of music cutting through the static, each burst sending a fresh wave of dread through their spines. Elliot, turning to scan the back seat for any signs of the unseen pursuer, felt a cold breeze brush against his neck, despite the windows being firmly shut. He shuddered, pulling his jacket tighter around him. "Do you feel that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. James nodded, his focus on the road unwavering. "Just keep looking forward. We can't stop. Not here, not now." Suddenly, the headlights flickered, casting them into darkness for a heart-stopping moment before flickering back to life. The road seemed to undulate before them, the lines and edges warping in the dim light. James fought to keep the vehicle steady, his breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. "There!" Elliot pointed to a faint light ahead, a beacon in the overwhelming darkness. Hope surged through them as they neared what appeared to be a gas station, its neon sign flickering erratically. They pulled into the station, the Jeep's engine sputtering as it came to a stop. The place was deserted, the windows boarded up, the pumps old and covered in rust. Yet, the light offered a small oasis of safety in the enveloping dark. They didn't speak, the silence between them heavy with unasked questions. Who had turned on the light? Was it a trap, or was it genuine refuge? Despite the eerie setting, the need to regroup and plan their next move was paramount. As they gathered their thoughts, a soft thumping sound came from the direction of the restroom. Cautiously, James approached, his hand resting on the door handle. He glanced back at Elliot, receiving a nod, and pushed the door open. The light inside was flickering, casting strange shadows against the walls. The room was empty, save for a mirror cracked in a spiderweb pattern. As James stepped closer to inspect it, his reflection seemed to warp, his features twisting grotesquely before snapping back to normal. Startled, he stepped back, bumping into something, or someone. Whirling around, he came face to face with an old man, his skin as pale as the moonlight, eyes deep and knowing. "You shouldn't be here," the old man rasped, his voice a dry whisper. "Who are you?" James demanded, his voice echoing slightly in the small space. "A watcher," the man replied, his gaze piercing. "This place, it's cursed. You've seen its power, felt its wrath. It doesn't forgive, nor does it forget." Elliot joined them, his face pale. "What does it want?" "Sacrifice," the man said simply, as if that single word explained everything. James shook his head, frustration and fear mingling. "How do we stop it?" The old man smiled, a grim, humorless curve of his lips. "You don't stop it. You survive it, if you can. Keep moving. Don't look back." With that cryptic advice, he faded into the shadows as if he had never been there. James and Elliot rushed outside, the cold night air slapping against their faces. They jumped back into the Jeep, the engine roaring to life with an urgency that matched their fear. As they drove away from the gas station, the sun began to rise, the first light of dawn casting long, ominous shadows across the Phantom Mile. The road ahead remained shrouded in mist, a visual metaphor for their uncertain future. Behind them, the gas station receded into the distance, becoming nothing more than a speck on the horizon, its secrets enveloped in the rising daylight. Yet the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, persisted. The Phantom Mile was not done with them yet. As they drove, the realization that they were far from safety, from understanding, settled deep within their bones. The road stretched on endlessly, each mile unraveling more of the dark tapestry that cloaked their fate, the jeep's headlights cutting a swath through the clinging fog, a lone beacon in the enveloping darkness. The whispers returned, a soft, sinister susurration that seemed to come from the very air around them, speaking of forgotten continued from Part 3, horrors and echoing the old man's ominous words, "Don't look back." But James and Elliot had no intention of looking back, their only goal was escape, survival. Yet, as they drove, a palpable sense of dread grew with each passing mile, a sense that something was inevitably drawing near, something relentless and inescapable. The landscape around them began to change subtly. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches scratching against the sides of the jeep like claws, the wind howling through them with mournful tones. The road itself twisted more erratically, as if leading them not towards safety but deeper into a labyrinth of terror. James's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he tried to maintain control, his eyes scanning the road for any sign of civilization, a way out of this nightmare. But there was nothing, only the endless road and the oppressive forest. Elliot kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, the fear that they were being followed a constant prick at the back of his mind. Every now and then, he thought he saw shadows flitting through the trees, keeping pace with them. Whether these were tricks of his imagination or something more sinister, he couldn't tell, but it kept him alert, his body tensed for any threat. Suddenly, the radio burst into life again, the static louder, more aggressive than before. Between the bursts of static, they could hear snippets of a conversation, voices that sounded panicked, urgent. "Not supposed to be here," one voice said, cut off by a scream that chilled them to the bone. The radio fell silent as abruptly as it had started, leaving only the sound of their heavy breathing and the jeep's engine in the air. The interruption left them even more unsettled, the randomness of these occurrences adding to the chaotic terror of their situation. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, its light seemed to struggle against the darkness that clung to the Phantom Mile. The air grew inexplicably colder, a chill that seeped into their bones, making them shiver despite their efforts to ignore it. Looking ahead, James noticed a figure standing in the middle of the road. Slamming on the brakes, he brought the jeep to a screeching halt. The figure was a woman, her long dark hair covering her face, dressed in a tattered white gown that seemed almost translucent against the stark backdrop of the road. Elliot grabbed the camera, his hands trembling as he started recording. "Who are you?" he called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. The woman didn't move, didn't respond. Her stillness was unnerving, more a statue than a person. As they watched, paralyzed by a mix of curiosity and fear, she slowly lifted her head. Her face was obscured by the shadow of her hair, making it impossible to see her eyes, but they felt her gaze on them, piercing and intense. Should we drive around her?" James whispered, his instinct to flee warring with the paralysis of fear. Before Elliot could respond, the woman vanished, as if she had been nothing more than a mirage. But the cold dread she left in her wake was all too real. They drove on, the silence in the jeep now a heavy, oppressive thing. Miles passed, each one seeming to stretch longer than the last. The sun's light began to fade, shadows lengthening and merging until the road ahead was a tunnel of darkness. The Phantom Mile wasn't relenting, it was escalating its torment, drawing out their fear and exhaustion. Then, ahead in the dimming light, they saw lights, flickering, but unmistakably the lights of a town. Relief surged through them, the first hope they had felt in hours. They pressed on, the town drawing closer, its lights a beacon of safety. But as they approached, the realization dawned slowly, then all at once. The town, like the gas station before it, was abandoned. Buildings stood silent, windows dark, streets empty. They had driven into a ghost town, the sense of desolation palpable in the air. They stopped the jeep in the middle of the main street, the engine idling, the only sound in the eerie stillness. The town might offer a temporary refuge, a place to gather their thoughts and maybe find some supplies, but it was clear they were still far from safe. As they gathered their courage to explore the ghost town, a soft, haunting melody began to play from somewhere deep within the desolate buildings, drawing them deeper into the heart of the abandoned town. The melody was both beautiful and sad, compelling them to follow its source, leading them away from the jeep, their only escape. As they walked, the buildings seemed to watch them, their empty windows like eyes in the skulls of the dead. The melody grew louder, more insistent, as if beckoning them to come closer, to discover continued from part 4, its origins. James and Elliot moved as if in a trance, drawn by the haunting sounds that echoed through the empty streets. The music led them to an old theater, its marquee faded and hanging by a thread, the letters barely legible under the layers of dust and decay. As they approached, the doors of the theater creaked open on their own, an invitation that was as tempting as it was terrifying. Inside, the lobby was draped in shadows, the air thick with the musty smell of old velvet and forgotten memories. The melody seemed to emanate from the auditorium itself, guiding them deeper into the building. With each step, the music intensified, wrapping around them like a tangible force. The auditorium was bathed in an eerie glow, the source of which was not immediately apparent. Rows of dusty seats faced a stage that was set as if for a performance that had never begun, or perhaps had never ended. They found themselves standing before the stage, the music now enveloping them completely, its melancholy notes plucking at their nerves. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the music stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, a heavy blanket that threatened to smother them. The stage curtains rustled, and a spotlight flickered to life, focusing on a figure standing center stage. It was the woman from the road, her dark hair now pulled back to reveal her face, pale and beautiful, yet filled with an unspeakable sadness. Her eyes met theirs, and in that moment, they felt an overwhelming sense of despair wash over them, as if her sorrow was a tangible thing that could drown them. "Who are you?" James managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper in the vast, silent auditorium. The woman's lips moved, but instead of a voice, what came out was the melody they had followed, now sung in a voice so hauntingly beautiful it was almost painful to hear. As she sang, the air around them seemed to shimmer, and images began to flicker into existence around the stage, ghostly apparitions of people, scenes of laughter and music, of dances and plays, all fading in and out like memories surfacing from the depths of the mind. "You brought us here," Elliot said, not a question but a realization. "Why?" "To remember," the woman sang, her voice echoing through the auditorium. "To not be forgotten, like this place, like me." The images flickered faster, becoming more frantic. Scenes of joy were replaced by darker ones, of a storm, of fire, the theater burning, people trapped, their ghostly screams silent in the ethereal display. "This was your life?" James asked, the scenes before him making his heart ache with a grief that was not his own. "Yes," she sang. "And now it is my prison. Until someone remembers, until someone knows." "What can we do?" Elliot asked, his skepticism long since burned away by the reality of their haunted journey. "Tell my story," the woman sang. "Share it. Let it not fade into the darkness as I have." The images began to slow, the last few flickering weakly before dissipating entirely. The woman took a step forward, her form becoming less solid, more a part of the air and the shadows around her. "Will you remember me?" she asked, her voice now just a part of the melody that lingered in the air, sad and sweet. "We will," James and Elliot promised, and as they spoke, the spotlight flickered once, twice, then went out, plunging the theater into darkness. When the lights came back on, the stage was empty. The woman was gone, her presence just a memory in the echo of her song that lingered faintly in the air. James and Elliot left the theater, the weight of their promise heavy on their hearts. As they walked back through the ghost town, the sun began to set, casting long shadows that seemed to whisper of forgotten things, of stories untold and lives unlived. They knew they had to leave, to escape the Phantom Mile, but they also knew they had a story to tell, a promise to keep. The road out of town stretched before them, long and winding, leading back into the darkness from which they had come. But this time, they carried with them a tale of sorrow and beauty, a haunting melody that would not be forgotten. And as they drove away, the shadows of the trees seemed to lean closer, as if listening, as if waiting for the story to be told.